And recording it. I can't record it. Thank you, Carl. So good afternoon. For those of us who are listening to this podcast, this video seminar in Bloomington, Indiana, and to everyone else, have a great day. My name is Negar Pato, and I am the chair for this fantastic talk. The series you are listening to is a collaborative event between SESME, the Center for the Study of the Middle East in Indiana University in Bloomington, and the Middle East and Islamic Studies Aotearoa, New Zealand. Today, we are in the third presentation for this series, and we are delighted to have Dr. Sumaiya AlWahaibi talking to us about gender equality and the state and woman in Oman. Dr. Sumaiya AlWahaibi recently graduated with a PhD in politics from University of Otago in New Zealand. She has been honored with a fellowship from the Ban Ki-moon Center for the Global Citizenship, established by the former Secretary General of the United Nations. In addition to her doctoral achievement, Dr. AlWahaibi holds a master's degree in women's and gender studies from the University of Hull, UK, and another master's degree in international relations from Lutz University in Poland. Sumaiya's dedication to gender equality has earned her the distinguished title of Gender Innovation Agora 2021, and she's a young leader by the United Nations woman. Her impactful contribution extend across diverse regions, as she has collaborated with civil society organizations in Oman, India, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Poland, and Cyprus. Her focus has been on enhancing educational opportunities and programs for both young girls and boys in rural villages. Previously, Dr. AlWahaibi served as an international relations specialist at the Omani National Commission for Education, Culture, and Science, representing UNESCO, ICESCO, and Alexo. Before this role, she worked as a consultant in the Gender Equality Division and UNESCO headquarters in Paris, and as an education program support at UNICEF in Muscat. Thank you very much, Dr. AlWahaibi, for joining us. And without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I just want to start by thanking Dr. Nagar and, of course, the Center for the Study of the Middle East at the School of Global International Studies for having me as part of the Emerging Women Scholars talk. So first, I'll give an overview of my PhD project, then I'll focus on probably one snapshot, mainly on the early 2000 to the 2011, 2012, and maybe explore with you the impact of the Omani Spring on women, if any, basically. My PhD project attempt to examine and answer one central question, which was, what is the impact of historical, cultural, and socioeconomic factors on the formulation and implementation of gender equity policies in Oman, with a specific emphasis on the country's dependence on oil-based economy. Basically, the research project explored the underlying reasons for the limited political progress of women by analyzing the relationship between cultural norms, legal frameworks, state gender policies, and economic factors. In addition to this, the study shed light on the complex interplay between state institutions and the various social institutions that have shaped Oman policies toward women. The existing literature on the relationship between women's economic integration and their political progress in the Gulf often overlooks the multi-layered nature of this relationship. And so to address this gap, I adopted a feminist theoretical framework along with a state in society approach that emphasized the interactions between the state institutions and the social institutions. When I say social institutions, I mean education, the tribe, family, religion, etc., even schools. The analysis also incorporated gendered institutions as a method, and Stephen Luke's power theory to explore the gendered power dynamics that have influenced policy outcomes and women's experiences in Oman. So from this figure, I summarize basically my theoretical framework. The study tried to scrutinize the gender policies of the Omani government by analyzing over 600 government documents, laws, state institutions, basically 3 state institutions, the Ministry of Social Development the Women's Policy Agency, the Ministry of Economy looking into the oil discourse, and Oman Council, the appointed council and the elected council, Majlis al-Shura, considering them as the representatives or the focal points between the society and the government. This aligns well with the chosen theoretical framework. Gendered institutions approach regards gender as a social institution, and McDale's state and society framework emphasizing the state as a social institution as well, containing both its images as its policies, discourses, institutions, laws, regulations, morality, etc., and then also the practices, as in the real world manifestations, what we see from the state practices, basically. And so understanding the state-society relationship as a combination of images and practices offers us a very unique perspective, as the state actors and institutions can either reinforce or even sometimes undermine the state image. I think most of the time there is a disparity that exists between what the state projects its image to be and the actual practices or even the reality. And these various behaviors that may deviate from the normative standards can sometimes cause a misunderstanding of the state gender policies. And so this examination not only enhances our understanding of the ways in which gender and social change can be approached in Oman, but also opens possibilities for exploring different perspectives and narratives within the broader field of gender and development in the Arab Gulf states. Quickly going through methodologies, my research employed a qualitative ethnographic method with a constructivist approach. The study adopted an inductive and deductive approach to understanding the reciprocal relationship between gender norms and state policies. So an inductive overall approach, but data collection is hybrid, both inductive and deductive. I conducted over actually 80 semi-structured and unstructured interviews, at least 4 unstructured focus group discussions. Purposeful and snowball sampling were there employed to gather diverse perspective from relevant stakeholders. The data collection occurred in 3 phases, and it took over 21 months, so almost actually 2 years of data collection, which included a participant observation, elite interviews, subsequent thematic analysis, and finally expert consultations. The literature review obviously have informed the data collection processes throughout time, and examining the gender equity approach in Oman's public and private sectors within the context of oil-producing countries was placed in that. The participants of this study were mainly Omani women. They comprise over 60%, including elected officials, activists, professionals from various sectors, ensuring comprehensive insights, and to foster open discussions, a snowballing approach was utilized, basically. Lastly, by cross-examining state responses with individual accounts, the study aimed to actually uncover factors shaping the societal transformation beyond the rentier state theory. A quick analysis, and then maybe we will go to the snapshot from the 90s until 2000, 2012. Now, the main argument of this study revealed that economic crisis since the 1960s in Oman, rooted in the oil discourses, have played a significant role in shaping the dynamics of gender equity policies in Oman. The relationship between the ruler and the ruled has evolved from Sultan Said one-sided approach to paternalistic and caring stance under Sultan Qaboos, with the current state-society relations since 2020 representing a blend of both. However, the state's economic priorities, debt, etc., have consistently taken precedence over the citizens' socio-economic development, leading to persistent social and gender inequalities. Despite major development efforts and measures from the first 5-year development plan from 1976 to the beginning of the 10th development plan that started 2 years ago in 2021, the government's weaknesses and performance dilemma persist, perpetuating a loop of gender inequalities. Furthermore, the institutional philosophy of the state is derived from the patriarchal society, and this has definitely influenced and led the state. While societal norms such as tribal ideology have permeated state and social institutions, reinforcing gendered inequalities, these findings contribute to the comprehensive understanding of the complex interplay between economic factors, state-society relations, and the gender dynamics in Oman. So simply, when we look into regional and international outlook of Omani women, whether in the state-owned media, public media, or even majority of the research that was produced by Omani scholars, I would say, even sometimes Khaliji scholars, the overall image of women is glorified, and the magnitude of the state's top-down reforms and approach to empowerment of women as a tool, which is referred to as minha in Arabic, which translates to gift. Hence, women's rights are seen as a ruler gift to women and society rather than an acknowledged human right issue. And so majority of the literature written on Khaliji state-society relations, or even more rarely Khaliji women relations, whether feminist or not, they have been mostly described from the rentier state theory or even patrimonialism. And so despite a major theorizing from Khaldun al-Naqib and other scholars, major writings and theorizing of the Gulf state society relations, limited empirical scholarship have examined actually the Gulf state women relations, especially the laws related to women's rights, marriage, and family in the Gulf countries. All of them operate in interpretive but different ways under Islamic Sharia law. Actually, some scholars recently have provided valuable research on how patriarchal authorities utilize the legal and religious framework to suppress the non-state feminist actors, perpetuating gender inequalities and limit women's rights. However, there is a lack of detailed research on the historical development of feminism and even the mobilization of the law, especially in Oman. Most scholars have focused on the oil economy, the rentier social contract, opposition movement, Islam, tribal framework, right to representation, political culture, and even marginalized feminism in the Swana region. Okay. Moving to the time period that I want to focus on to discuss women's state relations from the 90s to 2012, which I have described in my research project as an era of an economic transformation, but political disempowerment of women from the 90s to 2012. This is a quote from His Majesty Sultan Qaboos, may his soul rest in peace. Throughout our era, we have given a priority the active involvement of Omani women in the prosperous journey of our nation's renaissance. The homeland resembles a bird, relying on both its wings to soar. Hence, what if one of these wings is shattered and broken? This was in 2009. So let me first maybe quickly really describe or summarize even this era that I call an era of economic transformation, but political disempowerment of women. The 90s have witnessed rapid societal and modernization and increasing consumerism, yet rural Omani women lagged in development compared to men. This was reflected in the following. Despite a peak of GDP per capita growth of 19% in the 90s, it declined to 3.5% by the 1995, mirroring global oil-producing nations, obviously. Women's participation in the workforce remained minimal, reaching only 10% in 1996. This highlighted a very limited representation from the early 70s. Challenges included educational quality gaps, inadequate rural women support services, with over 80% of government income from oil. The depletion at the time of reserves within expected 25 years posed a really significant concern. However, sustaining the social services became unattainable by the government, leading to decreased GDP per capita from 7,000 in 1990 to 6,000 in 2019, actually. This posed a strain on the new social contract due to the oil dependence, hindering the government's ability to maintain the rentier social contract. And so this income disparity between rural and urban women persisted, intensifying the state-society relations strain. This era saw a shift towards middle-class demographic, yet political upheaval in the whole Gulf, triggered by the Gulf War, of course, at the beginning of the 90s in Kuwait. This stirred opposition to ruling regimes. Oman faced its own legitimacy crisis in 1994. And to sustain this legitimacy, Oman then decreed its constitution in 1996, aiming for more democratic values and social justice. Despite initiatives like Oman 2020 vision, similar to Oman 2040 vision that we have right now, the economic diversification efforts struggled. From 1996 to 2014, GDP grew annually by 3% only, yet per capita income declined. And the oil sector, of course, dominated the economy. So challenges persisted throughout the 90s, this including the reliance on foreign unskilled labor, limited job opportunities for nationals, central urban governance. These policies aimed to integrate women into the labor market, but lacked specificity, and often reinforced traditional gender roles. So we saw women in education and in health mainly, or social care services. Quotas maintained male dominance in higher education at the time, despite rising female enrollment, and women political literacy remained low, hindering their civic participation. In the subsequent years, integrating women into suitable employment expanded to rural areas, but emphasizing rights compatible with Islamic law and Omani traditions. They were all hand in hand. Challenges included family-related struggles and even low political literacy among women, leading to hostility towards their civic participation in a shura council from sheikhs or even community leaders during the shura elections in 2003. So, what did this really mean for women? Contemporary Omani society revolves around two key elements: tribal values and Islamic principles. It was once traditional, but now these aspects have evolved into a modern construct, shaping collective identity over time. In the post-2000 era, a new collective self-consciousness emerged, centered on the state, diminishing the influence of tribal affiliation. Nationalism has been instrumentalized to integrate personal identity with the nation, fostering loyalty to the state, particularly through public sector employment. Of course, all of this was fueled by the oil revenues and rent. And so the initial rentier state theory suggested that Gulf state stability via economic dependence perpetuating authoritarianism. However, scholars challenged this reductionist view, citing evolving socio-economic or socio-political dynamics and the impact of events like the Arab Spring, women's movements, and the new media further reshaped this political behavior, which have questioned basically the rentier state theory. And here, let's look into one example, which is women's representation in Oman's Majlis al-Shura, which is the elected council. Women, if you look into the numbers from the first term in 1994 until the recent one, 2023, women's representation in Oman's Majlis al-Shura reflects a very complex narrative. Initially, the Sultan appointed women for 2 terms, and female members faced real challenges despite their increasing education and political awareness. Electoral success diminished post-2003, which was in the fourth term, basically, where universal suffrage was announced, highlighting structural barriers and societal resistance, notably from tribal leaders or sheikhs. To solve this issue, the Sultan employed the add and stir approach as a mechanism, basically a top-down approach to augment the representation of women in leadership roles. So for example, in this anticipation of Majlis Shura implementation of universal suffrage in 2003, the fourth term, he designated a woman chairperson for the Public Authority for Crafts Industries, followed by the appointment of women minister for the first time for higher education, and then the appointment of women minister for the Ministry of Social Development in 2004. So evident from these appointments of women to leadership positions within the family and caregiving sectors, as well as those tasked with preserving the state's cultural heritage, is a deliberate effort to maintain the historical significance of Omani women in the 21st century. Hence, their role, like the rest of the Gulf countries, remains focused on upholding the chastity of the nation. This signifies the perceived responsibility of women to safeguard the nation's moral values and cultural heritage, which is implementing of societal expectations for them to uphold these elements, basically. Within this context, women are regarded as the custodians of tradition, with a duty to adhere to culturally acceptable roles and preserve the conservative norms and values that define the nation's identity. Women's participation in leadership positions is often really limited, as they are primarily appointed to these areas traditionally associated with family. As here the table actually presents, there's a compelling evidence indicating that even during the sixth term, so after the fourth term, from 2007 to 2011 of the Majlis, there was a noticeable absence of elected women representatives, despite 55,000 women exercising their right to vote, accounting for almost 40% of the total voter turnout. In response to this issue, the women minister at the time of social development put forward a notion of organizing a symposium on women's representation in Majlis Shura. This approach mirrored the state strategy at the time of using scientific symposiums to basically address important topics that the state deemed significant. The objective was to reshape societal perspectives on women and their role within the Omani society. And so this symposium aimed at women's empowerment, and it yielded limited results though. The recommendations lacked substantive action, despite symbolic participation, or recommendations, like designating Omani Women's Day, 17th of October. Progress in women's political participation remained really intangible, which have hindered, obviously, the societal attitudes and political participation at the time. However, interestingly, after the conclusion of the second day proceedings, few distinguished women who have participated in this symposium were informed of the Sultan's intent to hold a meeting with them on the following day, and that he had been attentively listening to all of their deliberations from his personal tent. Furthermore, they were appraised of the Sultan's explicit validation and endorsement of all of the demands and recommendations put forth by the symposium. Albeit this promising formal image conveyed, the actual reality was somehow divergent, as described by a previous woman member of the State Council who actually presented a paper in the symposium. She said, "We were surprised to hear that we were going to meet the Sultan. I was going to present on that day about women's issues, but I was told that all our requests have been approved." And so one of any concerns was about Omani women who marry foreigners, not being able to give citizenship to their children. They told us that the Sultan was already aware of the issue, so we didn't really need to talk about it. When we mentioned the idea of having quotas for women in Majlis Shura, the elected council, the Sultan said he was against it. He believed that Omani women had earned their place in the council because of their own abilities, and not because of quotas. He encouraged women to work hard and succeed on their own without needing special help from the government. And so the Sultan apparently encouraged women to compete on equal terms with men and not rely on any special privilege from the government. However, a previous woman minister indicated something a bit different. She said that the gender quota was an implicit unwritten recommendation, yet it was not formally implemented at the time. The hope was it would be considered during the upcoming elected council elections. However, due to the protest in 2011, I left the government. Nonetheless, I maintained communication. Later, I received a call from the royal office informing me that His Majesty had approved the memorandum that was submitted and that it has been transferred to the Ministry of the Interior. Anyways, regrettably, I am unaware of the development that took place after that, and it appears that the memorandum has not been put in effect to date. Overall, the 29 recommendations that were put forth by this symposium were lacking in substance and failed to provide meaningful avenues for women's advancement beyond the realm of charity, volunteerism, and family care. This is evidenced by the fact that only a very small percentage, less than 10% of these recommendations focused on strengthening women's abilities and skills in the Shura processes. While one of the recommendations expressed a desire for women to achieve the rank of judge, it did not provide concrete proposals for legal amendments or practical steps to facilitate women's entry into that. And now, despite the passage of over 13 years actually, since the designation of October 17th as the day to focus on women's political participation, little progress has been made by the authorities in terms of taking substantive steps to strengthen women's participation or representation. As such, the day has become little more than a customary celebration, lacking any meaningful efforts towards achieving the mentioned goal. From this table, it's worth noting that despite the increase in number of women candidates, which tripled from the sixth term basically to reach 77 candidates in the seventh term, only one woman was elected in the Majlis Shura term that followed the symposium. So the symposium yielded only in one woman to be elected. And then from 2011 to 2015, I mean, it's the only term that we had one woman. However, the lack of success in electing women can also be attributed to the Omani Spring protest, 2010-2012. The aftermath of these protests not only drew attention to the concerns of the people regarding state-society relations, but also impacted the political atmosphere in the country, contributing to the lack of progress in women's representation in the council. I did not update this table to the latest elections from 2023 October, but I thought I don't need to. This picture is worth 1,000 words. There is no woman that was elected recently. I'm not going to spend much time on this, the Omani Spring. However, in 2011, Oman experienced a notable scale of social unrest as part of the wider context of the Arab Spring movements that obviously have swept across several Arab states. While Oman's protests were relatively less intense and compared to the other Arab Spring uprisings, they still had significant implications for the nation. The social unrest were characterized by demonstrations and massive strikes that called for political reforms, greater government accountability, improved living conditions, and increased job opportunities. The protests were primarily concentrated in various regions of the country. This included Sohar, Sur, Nazwa, Muscat, the capital, and even Salalah. Despite the government efforts at the time to address some of these grievances and hardships and implement limited reforms, the demonstrations continued to underscore demands for more substantial changes in governance and economic policies. The scale of social unrest in Oman at the time revealed the existence of underlying socio-economic challenges and political aspirations among certain segments of the population. It also highlighted the broader international influence of the Arab Spring movement, which ignited similar demands for change and reform in various countries across the region during that period. However, prior to the broad-based protests that took place in 2011, there were, of course, earlier grassroots movements that laid the foundation for this societal shift. These earlier movements played a crucial role in paving the way for the larger and more widespread protest movement that eventually emerged, as shown in this table. The comprehensive and complexity chronology of the Omani Spring events definitely surpassed the intended scope of this presentation. But if anyone wants more details, you can refer to Saeed Al-Hashmi's scholarly work titled Arabiya Al-Omani that was published in 2013. In July, as mentioned in the table, basically 3rd July 2010, a group of Omanis from diverse backgrounds, including 50 professionals and intellectuals, submitted this petition to the Sultan on the occasion of approaching basically the 14th National Day. This event actually, this event, or even this act of submitting a petition to the Sultan, is a very clear manifestation of what McDale refers to as continuous struggles and accommodations among different societal groups within the state oligarchic distribution of resources. This demonstrated also the state stagnations since the 1990s and its inability to incorporate existing yet constantly evolving social institutions in the country. The emergence of open online forums, social media facilitated these societal discussions and continued for years after the Omani Spring. The debates rejected the Omani sense of particularism that the ruling elites had successfully instilled in the society collective identity since the 70s. Similar to other Arab nations in 2011, a new generation of Omanis born during the Renaissance era or post-1970 found themselves at a significant historical moment. They had an opportunity to challenge their economic hardships through an avenue of revolt. At the time, this generation encountered a major issue of unemployment. The state officials' speeches were inadequate in addressing and achieving the desired economic, social, and political reforms. The protest, however, underwent various stages of self-restraint in expressing their demands. For example, they chanted, "The people want reform, instead the people want to overthrow the regime." This paradox of political culture illustrated that the protesters had imposed limitations on themselves by cautiously communicating their political aspirations. And so some scholarship utilized late frontierism as an ideal framework to deeply analyze the demographic and economic trends that have led to these movements of 2011. However, the theory has not really adapted to examine the dramatic alterations on the state-society interactions, gender relations, especially within the role of the new technologies and the digital social change. Furthermore, more even scholarship has underscored the sense of entitlement among Omanis, whereby the government is expected to address all issues pertaining to their livelihood. This indicates significant social change since the 70s that are driven by the oil rent. Given the country's economic and demographic development, these changes should have been addressed during Sultan Qaboos' reign. The findings of this research imply that the next sultan, the current one basically, might not be able to adapt the same paternalistic approach towards society, as it may be increasing, or it may increase the economic and social challenges that Oman is facing. Maybe to move a bit faster, I'll skip this part. Finally, we could explore the impact of Omani Spring on women. I think a significant outcome of these Omani Springs struggles has been the alteration of gender relations within the Omani society. The increased participation of women as leaders and agents of change during the 2011 protest. As of 2010, the percentage of literate women in Oman reached over 81%. Nevertheless, the worldwide rate of women's involvement in the labor market stood at 51%, whereas corresponding statistic for Oman was merely 25%. In 1996, it was only 10%. A notable development is that the number of women seeking employment rose majorly from 43% in 2003 to 64% of the overall pool of job seekers in 2011. And so approximately 80% of female workers in the private sector as well were receiving a basic wage of less than $1,000 per month. Please don't compare this to the basic wage in the US. However, according to the labor force survey from 2008, the educational attainment of Omani women in the labor force is higher than that of Omani men. The survey indicated that approximately 43% of Omani men in the labor force possess only educational qualifications below the general diploma, the high school diploma basically, or do not even hold any academic degree. In contrast, only about 11 of male Omani workers have attained university degree or even higher. So by comparison, about 23% of working women have qualifications below the general diploma and 29% of them have attained university degree or higher. This suggests that Omani women in the labor market have better educational profile than their male counterparts. Thus, the involvement of women in the protest can be viewed as a natural and inevitable outcome. And since the inception of the demonstrations, women have made a significant contribution, and their participation has been noteworthy. In fact, the number of women who signed the petition to the Sultan constituted around 40% of the total signatories, so 40% of them were women. However, as the number of participants grew, particularly the situation underwent a transformation. As mentioned by one of the participants from the Omani Spring 2010 and 2011, he said, the events of the first week were a source of great inspiration for men and women, the young and the old, and for all those who yearned for change, enlightenment, and freedoms. However, the situation that ensued was harrowing, particularly for women. The construction of the barn or tent was deemed necessarily to prevent women from being subjected to undue attention or temptation by men. Thus, women were relegated to exercising their democratic rights from behind a physical barrier only. The women that were involved in the 2011 protests in Oman had multi-layered demands, including the improvement of their economic situation, revision of the personal status laws, and granting citizenship to children of Omani women married to foreigners. However, despite their shared goals, the women themselves were divided into at least two groups. One of the leading figures in the protest recounted this. She said, during the organization of the People's Square, they called the People's Square, the square that they were basically protesting in Muscat, some women expressed a desire for a segregated space for women's discussions and activities, citing preference for privacy. A petition was also signed to support this request. Despite the majority of women voting in favor of privacy, a decision was made after 3 days of deliberation to allow for inclusivity and equality, thereby negating any discrimination in access to the square. This raises a question about the efficiency of democracy in authoritarian societies. And so this fragmentation of the women's group, informal women's group, into opposing factions or groups, either radical liberals or traditional women, diminished their collective strength, thereby undermining the potency of their demands. However, three of the key figures responsible for organizing the event within the People's Square, situated outside Majlis al-Shura in Muscat, were actually women, as indicated by Khadija. She said, I clearly remember one of the, sorry, I think this is not the one. Yeah, this one. As a group, we engaged in discussion regarding the organization of the square, which included fundraising efforts to provide water and food for the protesters. However, our suggestions and input were not always significantly considered among the key men organizers. The contribution of the three prominent women in the movement, namely Rima, I changed the names obviously, those are all anonymous names, Bakhita and me, were crucial. It is essential to note that other individuals played vital roles in organizing the square, including my sister, who became involved later but lacked explicit demands. And so, despite making at least two concentrated attempts within the square to challenge the status quo, the liberal women protesters faced persistent obstructions, marginalization, and also prohibited few times from even entering the square, with some being, implored or to depart, or even being informed that their presence was annoying to men. However, it's really important to note that the authoritarian state policies displayed really no distinction between individuals based on gender when it came to perceived threats against the monarchy. In several instances, security forces restored to unlawful practices, including abduction, torture, physical assault, and severe mistreatment of women who actively engaged in the protest. One of the women who experienced the ordeal of being kidnapped, tortured, and even imprisoned and put on trial during the event of 2011 provided an account here of her experience. She said, I clearly remember one of the kidnappers threatening, saying, if you don't back down from what you're doing, death awaits you. They beat me severely with a thick stick. Soon after, despite my awareness, I entered a state of hysterical laughter. I don't know the exact reason, but I felt sarcasm. It seemed ridiculous that 8 men would beat an unarmed woman. The more I laughed, the more they hit me. I felt their confusion and fear, and I remember their leader shouting that they would not have mercy on me. And then she says, amid all this, I felt an inner voice telling me not to be afraid, as they would not kill me, but all their actions could lead to killing us. And so, despite these obstacles, some women remained resolute in their commitment to voice their demands and assert their rights. However, due to this constant harassment, a number of women had to pull away from the square. And some of them have opted out to remain active through the social media. The remaining few who continued to deliberate on the situation from behind the veil inside the square were a bid to certain rules. The shift in attitudes towards women's agency, the women's agency reflected a broader societal transformation towards women's empowerment. And so through their involvement in the protest, women were able to challenge traditional gender norms and assert their rights as equal citizens, highlighting the important role of women. This represented also a significant departure from the previously held beliefs about gender roles within informal social institutions such as the tribe. However, the ongoing tension between the state's desire to maintain control and the growing demand for political participation and social change among the people created divergent image and reality. This had impact on women's protesters' endeavors to secure representation in Majlis al-Shura. In addition, the involvement of women in the subsequent protests in 2018, 2019, 2021 were marked by a sense of fear as they navigated a very difficult political climate where dissidents were met with state repression. The religious establishment obviously received significant criticism as well from conservative participants in the square. The square held topics such as constitutional court, women's rights, freedom of expression, citizenship, intellectual pluralism, educational concerns, criticism of economic reality, nationalization of oil companies, and even an equitable distribution of wealth. All of these were heavily debated. As such, these squares really transformed the political culture and represented an unintended consequence of the protest. During this period, the Sultan introduced a number of reforms that scholars have characterized later as throwing money at the people. There has been some scholarly debate on the extent of intersectionality within the reforms introduced by the Sultan. Some have argued that the appointment of several, for example, Zanzibari as ministers and undersecretaries represent a notable intersectional shift. However, this perspective is not entirely accurate, as many Zanzibari women had already held important governmental positions since the early 70s. These women were part of the very small, well-educated elites who were appointed to head various governmental departments. The 2011 protests sparked a series of subsequent movements as various social institutions and individuals continued to take their demands to the street in the subsequent years, driven by economic hardship by both the state and society. Some analysts have noted that civil society organizations have seen their responsibilities increase since 2011. Evidently, the primary drive for political change in Oman remains to be the economic crisis, rather than any genuine desire for reform on the part of the state institutions. While the government may engage in a kind of competition with reform advocates, many of these reforms were primarily superficial in nature and do not represent significant transfer of power or even authority away from the monarchy. And I would conclude probably by just mentioning a very recent televised interview for Yusuf bin Alawi, a former minister responsible for foreign affairs in Oman. He indicated that the 2011 protest marked the emergence of a new generation expressing their opinions. This assertion holds true given the increasing level of education within the society. However, the question here really remains for coming years. Can the state take the risk of entrusting the drafting of public policies to elected council, whose members are still largely elected based on tribal affiliation and actually excludes women actively? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sumaiya. Very interesting topics. If you stop sharing your position, can I open the floor for questions and answers? Anyone has a question? Yes, Carl, please.
Well, thank you very much. I learned a tremendous amount, and I appreciate that. So it seems to me that when looking, so one of the things that I found most interesting was at some point about 25 years ago, the government said, well, in 25 years, we're going to run out of oil. So we're going to have to start thinking about ways to reform our economy. I didn't actually catch the date, but it was roughly a generation ago that you had that on a slide. And so then looking at the really dramatic increase in education levels for women, and the not so dramatic but impressive increase in economic employment, putting aside the elected positions,
Yeah.
what that suggests to me is that, well, one of two things. One, that there was sort of a conscientious decision on the part of the government to say, hey, we have to diversify the economy. And one of the ways in order to diversify the economy is to get more labor participation and more educational attainment by women. So was it an intentional, was the concern about changes in the oil economy driving public policy, or did it just happen to be the case that changes in policy toward women coincide with expected changes in the resource economy? And then just maybe to frame that, those predictions were wrong, correct? I mean, the oil economy is doing just fine in Oman, yeah?
To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, we have definitely less reserves than 50 years ago. But now we're also hyping on the gas, actually. So we have more income from that side. The first 10th development plan that started in 1976, so a generation ago, the main goal of it was just to diversify the economy, because as you have mentioned, they already knew that the oil is not a sustainable way to run the frontier social contract. And so when they finished from the first 10th development plan in 1980, I think 6 or even 1982, they realized that there's two main obstacles. First, they couldn't diversify the economy. Second, they couldn't, or they had an issue with the human capital, right? Which was mainly men, because at the time we had less than 10% of women employed in the government. And so they realized, well, we need to make use of the other 50% of the nation, right? Because we cannot really keep using the unskilled labor or cheap labor from other countries. And so that's where real efforts were made towards increasing women's presence in the labor force. So by 1996, later on, like after 3 development plans, women's participation reached 10% only. And then, more efforts were made. But then we got to a point where women were just exceeding men in education, late 90s. And so, for example, the main government university, Sultan Qaboos University in Oman, had to implement quota, because there was so many women entering the university, and there's a very small number of men going to the university, and that was an alarming thing to them. But then when women were not entering the elected council, it was an okay issue. We don't need to implement quota, And so there is, I would say, a genuine desire from the monarchy, from the sultan basically at the time, to actually involve women. But we need to distinguish between his genuine desire and the people around him, or the state institutions basically, and how they translate that genuine desire. Because at the end of the day, men were dominant in most fields, and still dominant in most fields. And actually, nowadays, unfortunately, the women constitute only 32% of the entire labor force in Oman. In 2015, we constituted around 40% of the public sector. This year, or 2023, actually, in the very latest statistical trends, it turned out that women participation into the labor force went really down. And there's now they are into a new challenge, basically. We're entering an era where there is a challenge in women sector, if I can call it so, because that's how they call it now in Oman 24th Division. We have women's sector, but no KPIs, no objectives, again, no specificities. And this is the issue that keeps coming from, as I have mentioned from the very beginning. It's a very, it's a loop, basically, of gender inequalities. They have entered women as a sector, an entire sector, but they haven't put an effort to define that sector, come up with KPIs. Maybe we want, 50% of women in the boards of, governmental companies. Maybe we want 50% of women in the Oman Council, which have both elected and appointed councils. But no, they left it to basically society, and they use the excuse that society is not ready. But then when there is an economic dire, when there's an economic issue, the state obviously doesn't really wait for society to be ready to introduce taxes, for example. Taxes were introduced 2 or 3 years ago, though the society definitely have gone against taxes, but they had to do it because the economic situation of the country or really, really bad. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Sumaiya. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Samira, please.
Sumaiya, thank you so much for this very interesting study and for the information that you shared. And maybe maybe some of you here don't know that I'm from Oman. So I'm quite familiar with the context and many of the issues raised by Sumaiya. And Sumaiya, you really did a great job. I mean, bringing all those numbers to the table and telling us, hey, we have an issue here. And I have a question, like I was also, and I'm still interested in the underrepresentation of women in the political sector. And I wonder, like, to what extent, because you mentioned something very interesting. You mentioned the low political literacy among women in Oman. And I wonder to what extent we can like say that education or curriculum in Oman can contribute either positively or negatively to this issue. Does it have any role? And if it does, how can we describe that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. It's a great question, actually. And you come from education, so you're the perfect person to actually even brainstorm around this matter. I think political socialization and political culture is absolutely absent, and I'm sure you know this from our curriculums. There is, I mean, I have to say this bluntly, until probably 5 years ago, I didn't even know about the Far War, for example. There is a major state discourse that was intentionally and clearly hidden, or let's say worked around to not be even relevant. So our curriculums really does not mention even, I think, Majlis Oman until very recently. This political socialization, of children, and how you make them aware that, well, we have, for example, a parliament. When you are 21, you can vote. When you are 30, hey, you can run for office. What is the role of the council, for example? A lot of major really political and civic engagement necessary steps were really abolished from our educational system. Again, we don't really need to focus maybe in major historical events that have happened and were not even mentioned in our curriculums, and we had to learn them later on. And I touch upon this in my dissertation. I clearly mentioned few major events that were not present, and I knew about them just 5 or 6 years ago. And it might be crazy, and people will be like, how come? And you're studying political science, where, in Oman, all of these books are not allowed. Anything that goes against the state discourse basically is not allowed to enter the country. These books are not allowed to, be purchased, for example. I mentioned a book here by Saeed al-Hashmi that he's one of the very first who theorized for the Omani Spring. He's Omani, who's based in Oman, but his book is not here. It's not available in Oman. You can either purchase it outside Oman or through Kindle, for example. So yeah, there is a severe censorship, obviously, towards a major political events, which is, I think, by now, in 2024, is to be honest, a very ridiculous thing to do, because, well, we're open now. The social media is there. Everyone, even 4 or 5 years old child now has access to their iPad, to the internet. You can easily get access to massive amount of information. Why not formalize it? Why not make it legit from the state discourse basically into the curriculums, instead of making people go out there, seek the information that might actually not be even accurate in most times. So yeah.
I can't agree more. I can't agree more with you, Sumaiya. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to use my privilege as the chair and ask a question. I know we are running out of time, but Sumaiya, you and I have been talking about this. I mean, every time I listen to you, I enjoy your work more. We have been talking about how the councils of women in Oman have been pretty much crippled by a lot of these policies. But my question is about as you know, UN is putting a lot of emphasis on women participation, particularly in development projects or any projects that happens in different countries and in developing countries. I wonder if you think that these councils of women in Oman or women organizations in Oman, would they have the capacity to work as a consultation organization when there is a project happening in Oman? So, for example, if there is a aid coming from UN, if there's a project that is happening in Oman, do you think that they would have the capacity to be nominated as a consultant or work with another consultant in order to contribute to gender equality, at least in those development projects? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. The Omani Women Associations is unfortunately, as you have mentioned, incapacitated by so many obstacles, and they have been really mainly dysfunctional, at least to serve women's, issues, basically. Would they have the capacity to be consultants for any UN aid project or even any UN development project? It depends on the city that you're talking about, because we have around 60 or 62 Omani associations, جمعيات المرأة العمانية, and the one in the capital or in the major cities can be actually entrusted to do the work. And we have seen recently, we had the cyclone 2 years ago, I think, and the major aid that was distributed was done by the Omani associations, women associations actually, and they were the ones who were coordinating, sending volunteers. They were doing their part, and actually not only them, men in these areas actually were also contributing. But they're good with coordination in major cities. The problem is that the further is the Omani Women Association from the capital, the further they are from the state control, the further they are from the state discourse and narrative, you would see not a completely, but a really, really different image to these associations. Sometimes good, sometimes really, really terrible. In some situations, I was really happy to see women associations who are working on a real women issues that the government was trying to protect for so many years, that we don't have violence, we don't have family issues, and we don't have, for example, even, we don't need the shelters, for example. And I went to these associations outside the capital, at least 300 kilometers away, for example, in Sur, and they were providing all of these services. And then in other cases, I think I went to Southern Al-Batna, which is only 1 hour and 15 minutes away from the capital. And the Omani Women Association building was closed, was actually locked. And I called the lady, the head of the association. I was like, hello, I called you before for a meeting. Are you there? And she came with a key. And I asked her, this is a lovely building that you have. The government spent so much money on this building. Why are you closing it? Why there is no nursery? Why there's no women activities? I mean, the weather is nice. It was winter. And she was like, I'm just afraid that these women will ruin the building. As easy as that, huh? This is her real explanation. She was afraid that the women will actually ruin the building. And so would they be interested in this case? No. You need to know which part of the Sultanate, women were more active, basically. And the one in the capital are the ones who actually have started this women associations movement in the 70s. As I have mentioned in my dissertation, and it was not because of the state, it's because of these women who actually had the desire to be organized in a way or another. And you know how difficult it is to organize women formally or informally in the Middle East, not only Oman. But they succeeded basically to do it. And now, after 53 years, we have 60 branches of the association, Some of them are dysfunctional, a bit of them are doing good, but yeah, there's so much work to do for the government, basically.
Thank you very much, Sumaiya. It was an absolute pleasure listening to you. Thank you all for coming and joining us for this talk. And I look forward to talk to you again, Sumaiya. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you, Nag.